Hello and welcome to Rolling in Mills, and today we have another fantastic, and very distinctly aesthetic and beautiful film, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971, Robert Altman. Now, I was fortunate enough to see a couple of Robert Altman's films in their original 35mm format just a couple of months ago at this local cinema of mine. Ironically, despite seeing Three Women, Shortcuts, and California Splits there, I actually missed the screening for McCabe and Mrs. Miller for work reasons, and so I finally got around to seeing it, and I'm kind of missing out, I suppose, on the upcoming Criterion Blu-ray release of it because this film is so very visual, but it is so splendid, and this is definitely one of my favorite Robert Altman films. I've already mentioned the visuals just a little bit, and it's interesting to note that Robert Altman, for me, has never really been a particularly visual filmmaker. He doesn't come to mind as one of the greater ones. And that's not to diminish his films at all or say that they're poorly shot, because they often look nice and they're shot nicely, but generally what matters more is the characters of him or the story in terms of something like Shortcuts or Nashville, where it's this very complex, winding character piece, or Three Women, which is one of the better shot films of his, but that's still more about, the characters in that or the mystery or the dreamy state of that. And on the note of dreamy states, I love the way he does that in Three Women, and funnily enough, that kind of transfers over into McCabe and Mrs. Miller. The whole film has this wonderful, what I'd even hesitate to call this opium dream state, just this very comfy, snuggled in bed under lots of furs feeling to it. And that's kind of a strange concept, I suppose, for a film that is like a Western, or as I'll go into in a second, what Altman calls an anti-Western, because it actually subverts a lot of the genre-defining features of a Western within the film, which I really like. And I want to mention it's also a very decent film outside of that subversion. And I don't ever tend to just give brownie points to something for it being a subversion of something, like, whoa, you did something different, you're automatically good. No, it really has its own feel and vibe to it, and it works narratively and in a storytelling sense, while also subverting a lot of these ideas, like the strong male protagonist not being so much of a strong male protagonist, and basically the entire ending of the film. This film is just visually stunning. And there are so many wonderfully well-planned and well-executed shots in this scenery that is just amazing. And I think in that case, the cinematography is really benefited by the just beautiful and very intricate costuming, set design, set decoration, props, everything. And the strangeness of that is that the actual film itself has a kind of semi-disgusting color to it. It's just full of browns, and generally to me that just signifies something looking kind of poor and washed out, unless of course that's the effect that the filmmaker was going for, where it's okay. But here it works really well to kind of give almost the sense of just what mahogany is like, conceptually what mahogany is, like this kind of old and comforting and this kind of very rich and syrupy kind of feel to it, and that really kind of carries over into the film itself, like I was saying. Also benefited by a lot of the soundtrack being by Leonard Cohen, which is really strange, and I don't think it should work as well as it is, but it really fits, for a Western type, but what's not really structurally like a Western at all. One man with a guitar just singing and kind of dipping into the audio mix with his vocals. It works pretty well. It kind of feels like a bard kind of walking along with McCabe a little bit in some of the earlier writing shots in the film. And personally, I haven't listened to much of Leonard Cohen's music, but hey, I mean, this film's kind of sold me on it just a little bit. Just generally speaking, before I go on, this review will have the option to skip for spoilers when I decide to go into those, so don't worry if you haven't seen that. And on that point, the actual general plot of this film, if you haven't seen it or you need kind of refreshing. Basically, this character, John McCabe, in the late 19th century, goes and decides to set up this brothel, basically, near a mining town as just a small business venture. And basically, the story kind of follows his journey initially into trying to establish that and kind of being the big shot business person of this town. But then later introducing the other character, Mrs. Miller, who is kind of the leader and head madam of these prostitutes, and her character really coming in and challenging McCabe a lot on a character standpoint, personality standpoint, and also physically in terms of the actual storytelling itself. I just gotta say straight off the bat, I just love their chemistry together on screen. It really works fantastically, and mainly on the point that McCabe is initially introduced as a very kind of stock standard Western, Clint Eastwood type, stoic, calm, very confident and powerful character. You know, McCabe is seen playing this poker game and he seems to be really in control, seems to be basically playing everyone at the table, and there starts this rumor around that he's this character called Pudgy McCabe who apparently killed this kind of infamous gunslinger. So this film initially and subterfugiously establishes McCabe as this pretty stock standard character, but then the film during its midst in like kind of the early and mid stages basically goes to extreme lengths to completely undermine that image of his character, basically through the character of Mrs. Miller. And I haven't really seen this often in a film where the actual film itself kind of tricks you with that, where McCabe is basically revealed to be numerically illiterate and he can't do basic addition for his earnings with the brothel, and Mrs. Miller basically just takes over the entire operation from there in terms of saying, hey, you need to, invest in these things. Hey, you shouldn't do this. Hey, you should do this. And basically completely reveals him to be a total idiot and is right about basically every single thing that she talks about. I gotta say, I just love the character of Mrs. Miller. Just in general, she just feels so believable as this hardened and extremely knowledgeable and just generally well-versed and well-experienced kind of brothel runner slash operator of prostitutes. I'm not sure if there's an actual technical term for that, but I think her character is also due in large to the actress Julie Christie, who just brings her to life so vibrantly and just so brutally. I mean, she basically comes in and completely annihilates the audience's image of McCabe and almost becomes the sub-antagonist as of like 30 minutes into the movie. It's really strange, but it works very, very well as almost being the establishment of conflict in the story. You know, when you're talking in terms of film narrative, you have the conflict of the film or conflicts, which is basically why the plot happens. It's like, there is this problem, I need to fix it. And of course the initial issue is McCabe must build brothel and get it to run. But that isn't really much of a plot. It doesn't really have any strong elements to it. It's just, I have to do something, and so that's kind of vague. But when Mrs. Miller comes in, that's when the conflicts really start to tie in. So I think it's really interesting to have that element specifically as a character rather than an event. And also on that note, without spoiling anything, the actual event or characters that directly cause the end of the film are only introduced maybe like an hour plus out of an almost exact 2-hour runtime, which I also found pretty interesting. And that's also where the film kind of has this like dreamy state to it, is that there isn't a huge amount going on plot-wise for a while. And that would normally be a criticism, I suppose, for a lot of other films. And I think it's my main criticism for something like Shortcuts, where I feel like that film has way too much going on while simultaneously not really having a huge amount going on, at least for the first maybe half of the film, to be completely honest. But with this, and like I was saying, it just has this wonderful dreamy atmosphere that you really, really get lost in. And I think it's important to note that most of Robert Altman's films are what I'd call slow burning films. You really got to sink into them and kind of stick with it for the ride. I would highly recommend not just kind of watching half of one of his films and going, oh, I'm bored, I'm going to turn this off. Really do try to stick through with it if you do have issues with slower paced films. And hey, I'm not saying you're going to like absolutely love it even if you are opposed to like slower paced films, but I'd highly recommend just sticking it out until the end, because that's generally where there's like a very, very big payoff, and McCabe and Mrs. Miller is definitely an example of that. And just kind of randomly, I was mentioning that McCabe is introduced in this kind of strong sense with this poker game and with this mystery aura to him that he's, killed this gunslinger, and oh, is that Pudgy McCabe? Is that this guy? Then he just randomly orders what is his signature drink for the film, which is a double whiskey with a raw egg inside it. I just love that. I don't know why. It's just like a completely random element to the film that's so weird and kind of unique to his character, but it really fits. Even from the beginning, where he hasn't shown his true colors yet, but more like the film and Mrs. Miller haven't revealed his true colors yet. It just seems so natural to him, even though he's this like very stoic character. You're like, oh yeah, I can see McCabe ordering a double whiskey with a raw egg inside it. And just another interesting detail, apparently during the 3-month shooting time of this film, all of the extras were basically told, hey, you're going to be allowed to come up with the character that you want to be across the next X amount of weeks. So they got to choose their own costuming and basically walk around and do whatever they thought that they would be doing in that time period, in that town. And I think that's a really, really interesting approach. And I didn't know that while watching it, but one of my main comments and one of my main notes was, it feels so natural. It feels so real. Like this world feels very, very lived in. And I think that's such an important element for a period film. One of the worst things for a period film is basically where you go, that's a bunch of American actors or whatever nationality actors from, the 20th century, and they're just dressing in, 15th century clothes or 2000 BC clothes. Oh, they're just dressing up, and it just kind of looks so superficial. But it does really feel like arterial vein deep here, in that the world feels very, very genuine. It feels like they actually rocked up to a town in the late 19th century and just film stuff there, and I love that. Also, for any Deadwood fans, this is actually Keith Carradine's debut anything, and if you don't know who he is, then he plays Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood, and he is so very young here. And while it is a bit part, he does give off a pretty good performance without kind of spoiling his role in the film, for those of you who haven't seen it. And for those of you who haven't seen Deadwood or aren't aware of it, please check it out. It's a fantastic HBO show. Just watch it. You don't even need context. It's HBO. Just watch it. It's very similar to this film, actually. I think that was one of the initial things. I got very heavy vibes, and I feel like it was probably pretty heavily influenced, especially with the whole casting of Keith Carradine. It reminds me of the same way that The Sopranos cast a bunch of people from The Godfather, and especially Goodfellas, where, hey, we're getting real actors and extras from the things we're directly paying homage to. It's nice. Okay, so I'm going to go into spoilers now. Basically, click this if you have not seen the film, and this will basically take you to my conclusive points, which will also be spoiler-free, and yeah. I gotta say, one of my favorite scenes in this whole film is where McCabe is basically like starting to warm up to Mrs. Miller and is starting to realize he's attracted to her, and he's in bed with her, and obviously he's been sleeping with her a little bit as a prostitute, but he really starts to like open up emotionally to her, and he's saying all this stuff, and then she still makes him pay $5 at the end, and I just absolutely love that about her character, and it really serves to like kind of condense and exemplify perfectly what their characters are like, where to his core McCabe is this kind of like cowardly and weak person with this like tough stoic guy facade, the way he like smokes his pipe and wears the coats, and he kind of looks like a child when he does it. And I love that it just takes this woman like a couple of days to basically completely tear that down and turn him into like a crying baby. And in that same way, I love that Mrs. Miller is just so experienced in this and so probably used to men loving her emotionally, and her just being a cold and detached prostitute basically, and just goes, yeah, you still got to pay me. And just perfect. Great scene. And also on the note of Mrs. Miller, I gotta really kind of give credit to the fact that in the film there's this very, very subtle underlying element of her having an opium addiction. When it's first revealed where she's just in her bedroom and she's just, smoking out of an opium pipe, I was like, oh, okay, they're gonna integrate this as some sort of element in her character, and maybe she gets caught with opium and then this happens. Maybe she's like too high on opium one time and can't, do some sort of business deal, and, everything kind of goes to shit. And I was kind of expecting that, but it never really comes to fruition. And the last time we see her, interestingly, is just in an opium den, and this is like only the third time it's been referenced to her using it. And it never becomes a plot element. And yet again, this seems like it would be a criticism for another film where I'd say, oh, it was just, some sort of useless subplot. I don't know, it didn't go anywhere, it didn't do this. It seems to be like McCabe's, double whiskey egg thing. It's just this like quirk to her character, and it adds this depth without actually really exploring what it means for her to have this opium addiction. There's no big speech like, oh, I have to smoke opium, to deal with my pain as a prostitute. It's all completely surface level in the way they depict it. And yet again, that would be a criticism for another film, but I don't think it is one for this. I'm somewhat neutral on it in that it's very, very open to interpretation, but I can't really give it marks for like really deeply exploring her character in this way and her opium addiction and, integrating it into the story. But in the same sense, I love that it's just something that maybe gets a whole like, minute 30 screen time, but it has this layer of like, oh, okay, she uses opium, but she's this really, really hardened character. Okay, but what does she use opium for? Okay, maybe it's to deal with her issues. Maybe she's had this addiction for some time. Sometimes prostitutes, lured in with drugs, and then for prostitution, they're given the drugs in return. So maybe she gained that addiction there years and years and years ago, and she can't kick it, or I don't know, maybe she does it recreationally. And I love that that's just so open. It's just such a minute character element, but it just opens up such a wide range of possibilities for her character. So I really like it for kind of changing the norm in that regard. And I guess you could say that it is used as a plot element because it's like last time we see her is as this very directionless character just kind of in an opium den lying down, but it was never really depicted as having, destroyed her life or completely taken over it. So I'm not really sure. But like I was saying before, it is like very anti-Western, Western the genre in terms of the main female character, which is generally speaking the love interest. Instead of getting with the man, the main protagonist is instead this completely directionless person, and also the main character is dead. And on the topic of further subversions, I was mentioning earlier, I really, really like that McCabe is set up as this very, very stoic character, and that's later torn down a fair bit with Mrs. Miller. But there's this great scene later where McCabe is trying to negotiate with these people to basically not kill him over not selling his land to them, because this very dodgy, illegal mining company basically says, hey, we want to buy the land that your brothel's on. It's very, very expensive. Hey, you know, we need to take this. And he goes, nah, you don't need that. And they go, okay, well, we're basically just going to send out people to kill you. So McCabe kind of goes to these thugs very high and mighty and very, very confident, and is basically completely torn to shreds by this one character I really, really like, this character called Butler. And he only has about, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes screen time yet again, but his aura in the film is just amazing. He basically just clean cuts through McCabe's entire facade like a hot knife through butter, you know, and basically dispels this myth that's been surrounding McCabe that, you know, he killed this very, very famous gunslinger. And after McCabe leaves in this really disgusting, cowardly fashion, this guy Butler is like, you know, McCabe has never killed a single person in his life. And I really like the evolution of that, because in my mind, for me, you know, McCabe's set up and it's like, oh, he killed this guy, and I'm like, okay, I'll accept that. And then later on, you kind of see his character being much weaker, and you're like, how was this guy a famous gunslinger? I don't see that in my mind. Maybe he accidentally killed this infamous gunslinger. Okay, maybe that happened. And then by the end with Butler and, you know, his reaction to that, you're like, no way did McCabe ever do this. But in that same sense, it's never really revealed if he did or didn't. You're assuming he didn't by the end, but then it's like, how did that story come about? Did McCabe just start lying about that? Yet again, unendedness and open-endedness can be bad, but I really like it here in that it's just vague and leaves that aura of mystery around his character, but totally changes the context of what that mystery is. Now, onto what this film is kind of most famous about, these like anti-Western elements. I've briefly mentioned a couple of them, but the ending is really what kind of cements this as truly unusual in terms of the genre. Now, for the most part, I don't think it is generally a very, very standard Western. A lot of it is very, very dialogue heavy. You know, when I think Western, I think broad, outdoor, middle of the day, you know, outback America. But here, a lot of it is very, very snowy, lots of interiors, lots of dialogue and character setup and kind of short, small scenes establishing things. And so for me, it already isn't like a Western. It's just kind of set in the era, but the ending definitely edges towards that kind of one character at high noon conflict with the actual physical bad guy threat, you know, like the main thug and his kind of sub-thugs, and it's like, okay, I can see how that kind of culminates into the same ending, despite the body of the film and, you know, all the aesthetics being basically completely different to a usual Western, like a spaghetti Western. But most famously, you have this ending scene where basically McCabe has a shootout with these three gunmen, including Butler, and it takes place in the snow, the very, very early hours of the morning in comparison to in a normal Western, you know, with this very, very panoramic, sunny, bright, you know, high noon landscape in the middle of the day. You have these elements of kind of underhandedness and sneakiness in the gunfight. Most of it in this quite extended sequence basically has McCabe hiding inside buildings and then waiting for people to walk indoors and then shooting them or shooting them at the corner of windows, and just generally being very, very sneaky in the fight, including the last reveal with him and Butler, which I'll go into in a second. It also subverts this whole concept of the townspeople who the protagonist normally helps during the Westerns normally stick indoors. You know, everyone closes up shop and is watching kind of frightfully as protagonist and antagonist kind of battle it out in the middle of the street. But for this, it's this really interesting subversion where all of the town people are running outside and running around the town because the church accidentally lights on fire and are completely oblivious to the entire gunfight that's going on, including McCabe's death. No one notices, and that includes Mrs. Miller, who is already completely gone by this time. She's just dismissed McCabe. And you have this complete 180 where instead of the hero being lauded by the townspeople, he instead dies, even though he does manage to kill Butler and his other two goons in the process. He does die himself. He dies pretty pittily from blood loss, and no one in the town notices this entire event. And I really like that, like I was saying, outside of it being a subversion. I don't like it simply because it's a subversion, but I just like it from a character standpoint. I like that McCabe gets to prove himself in some small regard, you know, especially with killing Butler. He gets shot in the back, basically plays dead, which also feeds into that sneakiness element, and then turns around and shoots Butler in the head as he kind of gets too cocky and walks straight up to McCabe, just assuming he's dead. The only issue I actually have with this scene is that there's this very obviously fake snow effect over the top of it. And I've checked on Wikipedia, and apparently it's real, but there's no way I believe that. For me, it's very obviously superficially implanted over the top of the film. And it did take me out of it for a while because it looks like the way it's actually treated chemically is different, and it really kind of sticks out contrast-wise with the actual visuals. And I have a feeling that that's because they started shooting in the snow, and then some days it was snowing, and then some days it wasn't, and then they kind of couldn't wait for it to snow some days and, didn't know if it was going to snow other days, so then they just had to do it over the entire thing. So I don't blame them for that, and it isn't like the worst effect, but it did kind of damper my enjoyment very, very slightly. Generally, I just love this film, and I don't feel like that there's a huge amount to really deeply analyze about this. The characters are strong in how one or two note they are. They have interesting kind of subversions and complexities to them, but this isn't really like an extremely complex character piece. It's just a pretty solid, relatively simple subversion of the Western genre in some regards. I absolutely love its cinematography, and this is by far my favorite Robert Altman film in that regard. Also, soundtrack-wise, just beautiful. Just fits beautifully aesthetically as a whole, and I really got to give it credit for that. Kind of stylistically, this is probably my favorite of his as well, next to Three Women. It's got some beautiful set design, really, really great dreamy, kind of opium state atmosphere, great clothing, amazing generally technically, and pretty solid on a story level. This is an 84 out of 100 for me. And that's it. If you want to check out the previous review I did, which is at Pan's Labyrinth, you can check that out down there on the left. Shortcuts review will be down there on the right once it's uploaded. And yeah, that's it.